think of curiosity as a practice, and that means it's something we sometimes do and sometimes we don't do. So going back to my original story, I'm innately curious, but I wasn't practicing it because I was so focused on an outcome. That happens a lot in the workplace. We're just so focused on getting an outcome that we don't slow down to practice curiosity.
Welcome back to the Sparks of Gratitude podcast. Everybody, we are so grateful for you. Thank you for sharing your time with us. Gratitude can change and save lives, and it starts with each of us independently choosing to live a life of gratitude. We have an amazing conversation today with Julie Pham, who is the founder and CEO of a company called CuriosityBased, and she's also the author of the #1 best-selling book, 7 Forms of Respect. And we're going to have conversations about those. And I am very curious to learn about the impact of curiosity and how Julie helps people improve their lives by becoming curious. So, Julie, welcome to the conversation.
Randy, thank you so much for inviting me.
Well, I would love to hear you tell us about what is the genesis of curiosity-based and how did you learn about this?
So I got to tell you that it started because I wasn't very curious. So I'll start admitting that. So I am trained as a historian, and as I was finishing up my dissertation, I realized I didn't want to stay in academia and I wanted to go into business. And so I moved back to Seattle, which is where I grew up, and I helped my family run our Vietnamese language newspaper. Now, this was 2008. This was the start of the Great Recession. And when you run a community newspaper, that means you have to be very involved in the community. And when I started doing this, I was and I hadn't really done this kind of community organizing, community building before, and it was very frustrating for me because we would always do these icebreakers. And I'm just like, "Why don't we just get to the work? Why is it taking so long? This is so annoying." And so and I realized that I wasn't having fun. Other people around me were having fun. And so I started to look at the people who seemed to be having fun and who were leading well, and including my father, who's really a model of this, and just taking the time to build relationships and to learn from one another. And so I started doing that. And so I've got to say that the genesis actually of Curiosity Base is rooted in community building. And when I first started community building, I wasn't I wasn't very good at it, and that's because I saw curiosity very much about accumulating knowledge and not about learning from one another. And I really had to have that personal shift. And then the other thing I saw was when you bring people together from really different backgrounds, as I was experiencing, we were actually the newspapers in one of the most diverse areas in the United States, ethnically, racially, languages, and friction emerges when you have so much diversity. And and there is not a way to talk about it. And so that requires even more patience and more intention and more thoughtfulness and openness. And and so eventually that led to worked in the tech industry, got my built a community organizing fellowship that led me to building Curiosity Based, and it's really rooted in the practice of curiosity. And Randy, I want to pause here to really emphasize this. I think of curiosity as a practice, and that means it's something we sometimes do and sometimes we don't do. So going back to my original story, I'm innately curious, but I wasn't practicing it because I was so focused on an outcome. And I think a lot of that happens a lot in the workplace. We're just so focused on getting an outcome that we don't slow down to practice curiosity.
I love that story. And this is something where I think the parallel of gratitude and curiosity share so much, at least as a practice, because, like you say, I believe gratitude is a practice and a choice. Like I choose to practice gratitude and then I begin to embody it, or it becomes second nature over time, but it is a practice. And so I'd love to hear more about that, about how and why is curiosity a practice? What does that mean to you? And maybe you can share something about that.
Yeah, so the way that we generally talk about curiosity is we talk about it as a trait. You have it or you don't have it. And yeah, I actually think we all have curiosity. And sometimes we're in environments where it's difficult for curiosity to thrive. Maybe other people aren't practicing curiosity around us. Maybe curiosity isn't rewarded. because it's considered slow. And so the practice of curiosity comes down to these three elements. The first element is self awareness, the second is relationship building, and the third is clear communication. So I'm going to double click on each of those. So self awareness is inward curiosity. It's about how do I be curious about myself? How do I ask myself questions? And then the second one, relationship building, is how do I be curious about other people? So, Randy, how do I ask you questions? And how do I share myself with you so that you can ask me questions? And that back and forth, that means that's reciprocity. And that reciprocity is the foundation of a relationship. And so we need to have that back and forth curiosity for us to have a relationship. And then the third element is clear communication. So that's how do I listen to understand? How do I ask questions when I don't understand? And how do I tell specific examples and stories? And so that is not just speaking in abstracts or being vague. It's just going back to I care about respect in this way. I care about punctuality in this way. What's the specific story around that? For example, for me growing up, my mom was always late picking me up from school. So I have a lot of anxiety around that because the school staff had to wait with me. I carry that to this day. And Randy, now you know why punctuality matters to me. It's not just because punctuality is important. So those are the three different elements. And when we think about it that way, it's just, oh, there are some parts where I'm really practicing curiosity and other parts where maybe I can make more time for self-reflection. And that's actually the biggest thing that we see people say they need is to make time for self-reflection, that self-awareness part.
Okay. So this is great. This is getting into kind of the practical model of how you focus on this with the three steps, I suppose, and so the first one is self-awareness.
Mhm. Yep, self-awareness.
And I'd like to uh, dig into that a little
Mhm.
bit more. I mean, you explained, number one is self-awareness. What does that mean?
Mhm.
Maybe in more depth, and how does someone practice becoming more aware and that inward curiosity?
Mhm. So part of that is asking questions and asking myself why that matters. So I'll use the tangible example of respect because oftentimes when we talk about respect, actually when I was starting to do my research for the book, I'd ask people, how do you want to be treated? And people said with respect. It's like, well, what does respect mean to you? And they'd have these different definitions. People would often talk about the golden rule: treat people the way you want to be treated. Now, the thing about the golden rule is, what if they don't want to be treated the way you want to be treated? And then there's the platinum rule, which is treat people the way they want to be treated. That sounds great, except maybe you don't want to treat them the way they want to be treated, right? Maybe they want to be publicly criticized because they love that public candor. It's just that feels rude to me. I can't do that. And so there is actually, I have here right here a rubber band. And so to illustrate, so I actually have what I call the rubber band rule. And the rubber band rule is actually at its core, it's about self-awareness. And so with the rubber band rule, it shows, Randy, I can stretch for you, even though I'm kind of ambivalent about how you want to be respected. Maybe you want me to send CC you on all these emails, and I don't really like doing that, but I know that makes you feel included, so I'll do that for you, Randy. So I'm gonna
Mhm.
stretch. Kind of find it annoying, but I'll do it for you because I wanna show you respect. And so what happens is over time we're stretching and stretching, and then we're groups and they have their norms. And you know what happens when we stretch and stretch and stretch over time?
Yeah, it gets tighter and tighter until eventually.
It snaps and breaks. And so what the rubber band rule is about knowing, what are my breaking points? What's going to make me snap? And that is at its core self-awareness because I mean, especially I'm very stretchy and I sometimes pride myself on being accommodating. Sometimes I don't even know I've snapped until after I've done it. And so that self-awareness part is understanding, oh, I'm feeling really stretched here. And also being aware of the different environments and the different contexts, because I know that actually I'm much more willing to stretch at home than I am at work. And so understanding that our rubber band can be different with different people in different contexts. And that is actually different from the way we talk about respect. Normally people talk about respect as if there are these etiquette rules, as if it's fixed and universal. This is what we need to do to be respectful. But maybe it's different for you and me. And so at the core of 7 forms of respect, it's actually about how do we be curious about respect? How do we practice curiosity around it? How do we accept that we may agree on how it feels and yet we disagree on what does it look like? And that's okay.
So the self-awareness, I love that you're saying being curiosity about self. Here's an example about respect and kind of opening that up more to, I guess the curiosity helps someone discover that maybe it's not just the golden rule,
Mhm,
maybe it's the platinum rule, or maybe it's something totally different and more expansive than that. I've been on a journey of self-awareness for the last several years of uncovering and learning more about myself.
mhm,
And so much of it is about, well, what questions am I asking about myself to learn and uncover what's really in there and
mhm,
what's really under there? My wife is really good about helping me ask these questions about myself because I might make some statements or behave in a certain way, and she'll ask me a probing question. She's very curious,
mhm,
and she'll ask me the why questions, and she'll dig deeper and deeper. And often I don't have the answer
mhm,
because I've got some habitual ingrained behavior or belief or story that my behavior responds to, and I can't respond to, well, why? And so it takes a depth of curiosity to uncover what's behind that. And maybe, like you said, it's my mom showed up late to school.
mhm, mhm,
And oh, that's why I value promptness,
mhm,
right? And so when I uncover those things, then I learn what are my values, or I learned that maybe I've built some beliefs on top of something that I don't really care, that doesn't really matter, and I can kind of modify that once I learn more of what's underneath. So what other lessons do you learn about awareness?
Yeah, and I think that awareness oftentimes you can't do it by yourself. So always when some people say, "Oh, they're so not aware," it's just like, well, it's hard to do that by yourself. There's only so much you can get to by asking yourself questions, and that's where that second part comes in. Where are you willing to share yourself with others so they can ask you questions or they can react differently to what you just said, and then that helps you understand. Whoa, I didn't even think about it that way, and because if we're only having the internal monologue, then that's actually there's limits to that. And so the next part to get into the to even have more practice and more inward curiosity is actually you have to do it with someone else. Just like with your wife posing questions to you, you can ask yourself those why questions, but then she'll ask you another time and another time. And I think the other thing is I'm a big fan of brainstorming questions and brainstorming short questions because I am so guilty of having questions that actually have multiple questions and assumptions built in. And so I often have to take a step back and go, whoa, whoa, whoa. Let me break this question into little bits. And I'll give you an example. I remember I was really disagreeing with someone and Randy, this is an example of when I wasn't practicing curiosity and I realized it 6 months later. So where it's just I thought I was asking this question of why did you do this? And what I was really asking was, how could this possibly have happened when I told you not to do this? And so that's not me practicing curiosity. That's me. I want you to admit you were wrong. That's what I really wanted. And so when I wasn't getting that answer, I kept asking why did you do this? But what I really wanted was, I was wrong. And so, okay, step 1, recognizing that. And step 2 was just then thinking, "Huh, well, what happened in the situation?" And so then I actually ended up asking, "When I said this, did you hear me?" "Yeah, I heard you." "Did you believe me?" "No, I didn't believe you." "Oh, that's not about me. That's not about something I can control." And yet how often do we conflate hearing and believing? How often do we say, "Well, I emailed you. I put it on Slack. I told you." And we assume that person believed us, agreed with us, and yet we don't ask that next question. And so that's what I mean by and it took me quite a while to get there. And so I think that's something else for the self-awareness part is just even just giving us the grace of it's not gonna happen right away.
So you've clearly gone on a journey to embrace the need for curiosity. And what was one of the catalysts that pushed you to say, this is what I need to do for a living? To embrace curiosity, to start a company that trains people in the practice of curiosity. And what was the impetus behind that? And how do you provide value to them?
Mhm. So I had a wonderful job. I know a lot of people when they start companies, it's because they hated their job. I actually had a job I loved, and I was charged with doing community engagement for industry association, and so I did a lot of cross-sector collaboration work, and that ended up being my second real-life PhD in organizational development. And what I saw over time was and I had this cohort, it was a 6-month cohort, and what I saw was some people did really well, some people were really thriving, and some people were really struggling with this collaboration work, and it was very ambiguous. And I realized that the people after by the 3rd cohort, because it was just how do we identify what's happening? Why are some people thriving, some people are struggling? We identified curiosity because it came down to the people who were struggling were just so fixated on it getting a certain outcome. It had to look this way, and when it diverted from plan, they were so frustrated. And then there were people who were just, "Wow, look at what I'm learning." These are the people who are thriving. "Look at what I'm learning. I had no idea. We created something out of nothing." And then what we saw on any given team, because they were on teams, if there was a critical mass of those who were thriving and who were really having fun, it could uplift the morale. And if there was a critical mass of people who were so focused on getting an outcome, it could take down the morale. Because there are a bunch of people who are just waiting to see how other people act. And so that's when I realized, wow, it's so important to have that critical mass and to also create the environment. Because I said earlier, one of the things that can hinder the practice of curiosity is people don't feel safe. If people don't feel that it's safe to practice curiosity. So how do you create that environment? And and so that's I felt called. I mean, Randy, I truly felt called to leave this wonderful job in the middle of the pandemic to start my own company to take that risk because I also feel really passionate about how do we make workplaces into learning organizations? Learning doesn't stop at school. And so I mean, I worked in the tech industry, which can be very extractive. And what I mean by that is tech companies can pay people really well and they expect them to do a certain job. and, you're performing and and you are there and there the transaction is very clear of why you are there. And if you are not performing at a certain level, then you are out. They don't actually have to invest in you as much. And yet there are other organizations where, like, well, we can't pay these super high salaries, but we can create cultures where we're investing in you. And you're gonna, when you come here, this is maybe what you start at, but we want you to do other things. And that there's also, it's not just about formal learning training. It's also how do we create spaces where people feel that they can learn from one another. I can bring what I know and you are interested in learning from me. And so that's a learning organization. And I think that that's actually for work to not feel extractive, for it to feel that I'm being invested in, which means I want to invest in my workplace. And because we spend so much time at work. I spend more time talking to my coworkers than I do to my family. And so I think it's really important for me to continue the learning there. So that's why I started Curiosity Based.
right? To help organizations become learning organizations.
Mhm,
And curiosity, if it's based in curiosity.
mhm,
Okay. So I love that. I had a guest on the podcast named Gary Ridge. He was the CEO of the WD-40 company for a couple of decades, and he's just this legend in company culture. And he talks about, he says, we don't have mistakes. We don't have failures in our company. We have learning moments.
mhm.
And they developed a culture that permitted people to do that. And I talked to him, he said it took time. It took time to put this out there, but then eventually people would come and they had a type of invitation to invite the safety for people to share their failures, but they weren't failures, they were learning moments,
Mhm, mhm.
right? And then all of a sudden it became the culture of the company to make those to share that. And then everybody became they were much more bought in, the community was more developed, they would share and they would actually learn from all those things. I mean, in fact, the WD-40 company itself is named after its water displacement 40th formula. It took 39 failed versions before they got to the one that worked.
Oh, I love
And
that
so there
story.
were all those learning moments.
Mhm, mhm,
And so I love that that's what you're trying to bring to people.
mhm.
So I would love to hear there's something that you share as you teach this, and there's a visual where in this curiosity um, in process
Mhm.
where there's something that's this gap or this space.
Yes, there's this gap.
Um,
Yes.
so I'd love if you could describe
Mhm.
this to us and how we can visualize where curiosity meets and where there's this gap between?
So there's this gap between our expectations and what we actually get, the reality of what we get. And sometimes we are so fixed in our expectations and how we should have gotten that, that it's really difficult for us to actually even consider looking over at what actually happened, because it's just, no, that wasn't supposed to happen. And so I'm going to stay here. And it actually takes a whole process of of accepting, evaluating, hey, what were my expectations based on? And assessing, am I even willing to consider that there could be some other truth out there? And then to ask myself some really hard questions about, why did I have that? And then to be able to then share that, and then that will actually help us bridge this gap between what our expectations are and what the reality is. And here's the thing, I'm very clear, we will always have expectations. There is no way we can't have expectations, and we'll always have assumptions. I actually have one of our most powerful workshops is getting curious about our assumptions. And there's that, assumptions make an ass out of you and me, and don't have assumptions. Our brains are wired to have them. We cannot possibly not have assumptions. And I actually think it's, how do we get curious about our assumptions? I actually like to use the mental model of the visual of one of those resting dolls, those nesting dolls. It's just, oh, here's an assumption. And oh, I figured what it is. And then you pull it off and there's another one. Oh, wait a minute, what's that? And then you pull it off and there's another one. And and so that kind of actually helps us, if we can examine that expectation, then that actually really helps us get at the self-awareness part. And also acknowledging, Randy, it's really painful. It's really painful to acknowledge that. I mean, in my talk, in the TEDx talk, I actually open up with a time when someone told me, I was in the middle of a speech, I was feeling really good about myself, and someone said, "This is a waste of my time." And I was so humiliated because they said this in front of all these people. And then I was complaining about it with so many people. "I can't believe that happened. Can you believe that?" And, there are people who are validating me like, "Yeah, that's horrible." And then I had a friend of like, "Well, why did you say that thing?" "Oh, why did I?" And it kind of I start to realize that actually I felt a bit of entitlement of having a certain reaction to my work, and then digging in, and what was that about? And then moving through it and learning from it, because and it was painful. And I think that's actually another thing about practicing curiosity, is it can be really painful. It's like our cringy moments.
That's interesting. I like to see that you smile when you tell that story now, because I can also see how painful it was when you did so much work, you're presenting something, and somebody says that it was a waste of time. And how could they? How could they hurt you
Mhm.
telling you that you're having this waste of time? But what a wonderful friend who can candidly ask you the question, well, was it?
Yeah, "Why did you say that?" And she wasn't invalidating me.
Right.
She was just, "Why did you say that?" And and that's the thing, I think sometimes we're afraid of, if we ask a question, we're afraid that we'll be perceived as invalidating someone or challenging their pain. And this is actually sometimes where we have to invite it, because, here's another example. I remember I got an email from a client, and it was a request, and the way I read the request, I was just, "I can't believe she asked me to do that. How can't believe that." And I talked about it with a friend, and I said, "Hey, this happened. What do you think?" And she said, "Why don't you just ask her what she meant?" Like, "Oh, okay." So I went back and I asked, and it was totally reasonable. But I had this whole expectation, my reaction to my interpretation of what I thought she meant. And it was my friend who just said, and I invited her. I'm like, "What do you think?" She was like, "Why don't you ask her?" Oh, and so this is an example of, even though I guide people through practicing curiosity, I definitely am not perfect in practicing curiosity.
There's so much good stuff in this conversation with the interplay between awareness and expectation and so on, and the reality of where we are, and the gap between what is and what my expectation maybe.
Mhm.
So I want to talk about that a little bit because I just love this conversation. That gap, that whether it's an inch or 1,000-mile gap between what is and what's the expectation. I've been thinking about this a lot lately, the last couple of years, and so I want to tell you some of my thoughts. So I think expectation and assumption, you've stated that you believe that we'll always have those. I mean, our brains are wired to come up with expectations and assumptions and so on. And I believe you. I think evolutionarily that our brain solves puzzles and it takes shortcuts to survive and connect dots. And so that creates story, right? And it's the curiosity to go beneath that when we can uncover maybe an unproductive story.
Mhm, mhm.
Okay. So this is what I think about expectation. I'd like to hear what your thought of it is. I would be bold to say that in that expectation is not productive in any situation. I could be challenged on that, but I'm just going to put it out there and be bold and say expectation is not productive. And this is why. I believe that the best case scenario with an expectation is mere satisfaction. Because if I've set an expectation, consciously or unconsciously, and that expectation is realized, the best case scenario is I'm satisfied with something that was supposed to happen exactly like that, right? But nothing more. I'm satisfied because it was supposed to be this way. So, one, expectation is the thief of joy. People, this is a phrase that's out there. And so I would say that alternatively, if my expectation is not realized, well, I'm disappointed. I'm pissed off. I'm angry at somebody. It's someone else's fault. I can drop into all of these negative behaviors internally or projected out externally when an expectation is not realized. But if I exchange expectation for something called hope, it's different. Okay, well, I hope something may occur. I hope something might be realized. I hope this happens. Well, now what happens if it is? Then in that circumstance, I'm ecstatic, like abundance of joy, right? But if it doesn't occur, I'm not devastated. I mean, I hoped something, but it doesn't have the same type of disappointment. And so here's an exercise I've been trying. I want to talk to you about it because you teach people this and you say, there's this gap between the reality and the expectation. And how do we shrink that? One analysis I've been doing in my own head, and this comes back to awareness, is if I'm in a state of awareness, anytime I feel some disappointment, I start asking myself questions. I'm like, oh, Randy, there you are. And I feel disappointed. Where's that coming from? What was the expectation attached to that disappointment? And then sometimes it's obvious because I clearly created an expectation, but sometimes this is something subconscious that I'm not necessarily aware of up front. And I have to ask multiple questions. I have to open several layers of that nesting doll to find out what was the expectation I had subconsciously or built in a story from the past that's made me disappointed or that's caused this disappointment. And I learned so much when I'm like, "Oh, that's why. Yeah, I that's what the expectation was." And then I can learn from it, and it's painful sometimes because I have to, like, accept I have to accept my own sometimes unreasonable behavior and expectations that I've set. So, what are your thoughts on this conversation?
So, I don't think expectations are counterproductive. I think it's actually the thing that forces us to learn.
Okay, we're gonna fight about
That's
this.
what I do, and actually, because it's even, you said you saw me smile as I was telling this story, right? Because now you're just like, "Oh, I wanna get to a point where I can be delighted when I'm surprised." When it's just like,
Mm,
"Oh, yeah, it was embarrassing, but it was kind of hurt so good. I got through it. I'm proud of getting through it." And we actually have to have those it was hard for me to feel a sense of accomplishment. And so actually, I'm gonna um, I'm going to even differentiate a little more. So I think that there's expectations, I think there's hopes, and then I think there are wishes.
okay.
So
Let's
expectation
go. Let's dig in.
so expectations, I think of that's just that satisfaction, right? It's just like I expect this. I expect when I go to a restaurant and I order something, I will get a certain kind of service. And if anything beyond that, oh, I've just been delighted, but I would have been fine if they just smiled, gave me my drink. What? They drew my name and something special? That's an extra level of delight, right? I had no expectation about that actually exceeded my expectations. Hope is actually it's it's not an expectation. Hope is something where, "Oh, I'd like it to happen. There's a possibility that it could happen, but I'm not really expecting it. I know that it's still a stretch." And then there's a wish. I wish I could win the lottery, right? Like, there's right, there's very little chance, but I still have that wish. And so I think that there are these different levels, and then but with a hope, though, as I've done a lot of thinking about how hope and disappointment define each other. I think of them almost like this yin yang. It's just you can only have hope if you have disappointment. It's you can only call it disappointment if you risk hope, if you really want something. And you can only call it hope if you risk disappointment, that you will actually feel sad if you don't get it, which is different from actually anger or annoyance. I can't believe they didn't give me my drink the way that, that was the basic level of service and I didn't get that. That's an expectation. And and so I think that actually when we experience the most pain is with hope because hopes are also vulnerable. Hopes are really and wishes it's like, well, I didn't really expect it anyway. That was just winning the
Yeah,
lottery.
there's no risk attached to
Right,
the
lottery,
wish.
right? But that I mean, this is think about I really want this job. I really want this promotion. There's a chance. There's a chance I could get it. I worked really hard. Do I share that hope with other people? Maybe I do the first time, but if I don't get it, am I going to share it the second time? I think a really common example of this is people in pregnancy. How they say, don't wait until you get to a certain stage in the pregnancy. Why? Because 10 to 25% of pregnancies end in miscarriage. And then you don't wanna share your disappointment with everyone. And I think that it's interesting because we say you can't say avoid disappointment. To say, like, "Don't be disappointed," would be like saying, "Don't have hope."
Right. Or, don't open your eyes.
Yeah, right? And so actually, I'm really fascinated by how sometimes there can be there's this toxic positivity, which is like, "Oh, if I share something I'm disappointed by, it's just, oh, well, it's because of this and this and this." I'm like, "Look, I'm just disappointed. I had a hope. Is it okay for me to have wanted something?" And just and so because I think it's actually really interesting how we don't talk about our hopes if they don't get realized, because it's so vulnerable.
It is, and I think this comes back to the awareness and curiosity and then being able to open that up because opening up to number 1, to feel the joy and also feel and acknowledge the sadness or disappointment. They're both valid emotions,
Yeah.
and they're meant to be felt.
Mm,
Felt and processed, and as you said, toxic positivity is on the surface putting a mask over the real emotion and just saying, "Oh, everything's good, I'm so blessed, everything's great," instead of acknowledging and honoring the emotion for what it is and processing it and feeling the disappointment, and then, like you said, being curious about, "Oh, yeah, I had the pain of disappointment or the pain of embarrassment, and I am so grateful for what I learned through that."
mhm.
Instead of just pretending that it wasn't there.
Yeah, and I mean, I'll share a very specific example, even with my TEDx talk. I worked so hard on that talk. I had 70 people review that talk. I was very proud of it. And yet, in the end, it wasn't chosen for the particular channel. So it's like being on local cable TV versus the chosen to be promoted to the network TV, right? Which really affects the number of views. And I was disappointed. I had a hope. I had a hope. I didn't have an expectation, but I felt it wasn't a wish. I mean, I felt proud of my talk. And and then in talking about it with people, it was interesting how people reacted to me sharing my disappointment because some people were like, "Oh, don't feel bad." And others were just, "Yeah, it was a good talk. That's sad." And so it's also how do you be with people when they're sharing their disappointments? And I mean, shared it with my team. I was just like, "Look, this was disappointing." And Randy, I did all the work. I talked through it. I practiced curiosity. And just a couple of months ago, it came up again. And I was just like, wow, I still feel that hurt. It's still disappointing. And that doesn't mean that I'm not proud of it. And it doesn't mean I'm not grateful for the opportunity and for all the people who helped me. And this is, my work as a historian. The thing I think about a lot is multiple truths can coexist. I can feel grateful and I can feel sad.
Okay, now we're getting somewhere else, Julie. So number one, everybody that's listening, I want to remind you that I'm grateful for you. And if you've listened this far, you could be anywhere in the world and you're listening to me and Julie have this conversation. So thank you. And if you haven't yet, you know, like and subscribe to this. Tell us what you think about it. Julie, your TED Talk is worth listening to. And I invite everybody that's listening to this to go on YouTube and watch or listen to that TED Talk. So it is wonderful, and there are some of the most amazing things on cable TV. Okay. You know how you put it, and you kind of laugh about it now. I also, um, you just said that two things can exist at the same time. Gratitude and sadness. And this is a repeated topic and conversation on this podcast is that the impact of gratitude. I can be grateful through pain, through sadness, through disappointment, even at the same time as having those things. I can have peace and gratitude even with pain, with sadness of loss. And talk to me about that and how that resonates with you and if you have other stories or maybe more depth.
It requires a lot of curiosity to think about all of the different emotions that could be feeling. And this is actually one of the big challenges when we're working with our clients to get them to identify the emotions that they're feeling. Because it can be so, for example, if you feel disrespected, the first thing is anger, just, well, they shouldn't have done this. It takes a few more to really dig in. I was disappointed. I was hurt. I felt betrayed. Anger, that first feeling is easy. It actually can make us feel strong,
But what's underneath it?
but what's underneath it? And we can feel all of those things. And sometimes we feel one and then it comes back and it goes, for like I said, I thought I'd done the work. I thought I was over it. And then I felt hurt again. What? It's still there. And and so it's and also confused. I worked really hard. Like, how did that happen or not happen? How did my hope not get realized? And so it takes a lot of curiosity, that self-curiosity. I'm also talking about it with other people because I shared what I felt with other people too. And then they share, in that process, after that happened, I talked a lot about disappointment and hope. And what I discovered was how hard it is for people to talk about their disappointments and how hard it is for them to talk about their hopes. And sometimes that's modeled from their experiences. Did their parents talk about hopes? How was hope discussed? Sometimes it's don't get your hopes up. Some people grew up with that. Or some people I talked to, they carried the hopes of their parents. You are my hope. I have struggled so much. Imagine having that association with hope. And so even as I was experiencing all of this disappointment, it actually in practicing curiosity around why I was feeling disappointment and what would happen if I shared my disappointment, I actually got to learn a lot about other people's feelings around disappointment and around hope and how that actually is very relative. All of our experiences, some people grow up in you can be anything in the households where you can do anything. And others are just you gotta watch that. No, it's just that influences how we see the world, how we even think about gratitude.
And so how do you see this when rubber meets the road? I'd like to know since you've started Curiosity Based
Mm,
and you've interacted with so many people and you're coaching and you're teaching and you have these models and you believe so fundamentally in the value of this, what are some surprising things that you've learned
mhm,
as you've started teaching people?
mhm. So those that in my TEDx talk, I talk about these 2 questions that when you have you have to assess your readiness to practice curiosity to cross that gap. And the first question is, do I want that other side? Do I want that person to learn from me? Yes. And the second question is, am I willing to learn from them? And that's a much harder question. So, Randy, one of the things I actually learned that from my clients. And what I mean is, took curiosity for granted. So, I'm going into these workshops and I'm just, okay, here's the structure. And now you brainstorm questions. And then I would pop into these breakout rooms and people would be, why do I have to ask a question when I know the answer? I know why they did that. I know why they were disrespectful. And I realized I had to create a speed bump. I had to slow them down because otherwise they were still locked in their anger and their feeling of outrage. And I had to get them to turn inward. And that's where actually those two questions came from. So when I wrote the book in 2022, I didn't have that. My next edition, I will. And it literally came because I learned that from my clients. Right. Another thing I talk about that wasn't in the book, but that's come since in my talks are there's a difference. The way we talk about respect is we talk about it as respect versus disrespect. We talk about it as if there's an absolute. If I'm not getting respect, that means you're disrespecting me. That's very black and white. And so now the way I talk about it is there's disrespect versus lack of respect in the forms that matter to me. And disrespect is intentional. That's how I define it. Randy, I know you don't like it. I did it anyway. That's disrespect. But most of the time, what we're experiencing is lack of respect in the forms that matter to me. Now, why am I getting lack of respect in the forms that matter to me? Maybe that person is giving me the golden rule. Maybe they're giving me something that they want. Maybe they don't know me that well. Or maybe every time they do that thing that's super annoying, I say it's okay. It's okay you're late. It's okay you never read my notes. It's okay you interrupt me. Right? Like,
Yeah,
we
there's a
condone
lot
it.
of
We condone it.
personal accountability,
Right?
if I'm curious enough to know.
Mhm.
Oh,
And so those are just some examples of how even I am evolving based on what I'm learning with my clients, because I think that the big shift is moving from black and white thinking, from right or wrong thinking. That's the hardest thing for people, because in the workplace they want to have simple answers. And I say there's illegal versus legal. And then and then there's this, and everything else is actually really gray. And it merits a conversation. And that conversation can be really difficult for people because people want neat answers. And I think that what we're really seeing now is there are just no neat, simple, clean answers.
so where do you think curiosity helps people find grace?
I think that we have to have grace with ourselves first. That's because oftentimes I did this thing and I'll just, oh, I'm horrible. I can't believe I did that. Oh my gosh, I made them feel that way. I need to be able to learn from myself and let myself learn from me so that I can then even accept that to give other people grace. So I think that it has to start with me, kind of going back to the rubber band rule. I need to know what my breaking points are. I need to know what matters to me before I can expect other people to know what matters to me. If I can't articulate it, then how do I expect people to read my mind?
Right. I believe that, I had another podcast guest, Dr. Ilya Grigoris, who says, you show me somebody who can't forgive someone else, and I'll show you someone who hasn't forgiven themselves.
Yes, yes,
And
absolutely.
so first we turn into ourselves and have that curiosity. And the deeper and more sincere I can get into that curiosity, then all of a sudden I say, wow, if I can have the grace and compassion for myself, the grace, compassion, forgiveness, acceptance of myself, well, now suddenly, isn't it a miracle that I suddenly have that outward grace and compassion for somebody else? Wouldn't you know it? It just works for them too. So I think for me, and I would suspect for many people, because let's face it, Julie, I'm human, and so are all the others. Um, it's hard. I resist acceptance of that, and I'm hard on myself, and I don't want to reveal that to myself, and so it really takes some humility to and curiosity to step in there and to allow that space to forgive myself, to give myself grace and understanding and so on. But man, isn't it beautiful when I can extend that outward? I feel much better. when I can arrive at that space.
And I think that there's kind of going back to the hope and disappointment. I mean, I shared with my team, I was disappointed. I wanted something. I didn't get it. That doesn't mean I should stop wanting things. We don't always get what we want. That doesn't mean that we stop trying. And it's and so even just to model that, look, I learned a lot. I can't control the outcome. And so even just sharing that, I was just, look, it's okay to want something and not get it.
So it's okay to want something and not get it. That just brings me to one of my favorite words is acceptance.
Mhm,
We've said it so many times in this is acceptance of what is,
mhm,
where I believe that gratitude, guys, this is the theme of the podcast. Gratitude is the highest form of acceptance of what is
mhm,
because I don't have control over everything, but I do have control over my attitude and how I respond in any given set of circumstances. That comes from man's search for meaning.
mhm,
And um, gratitude can even come through pain and disappointment.
mhm.
And that is the highest form of acceptance. Julie, um, I would love to know what you could, and just the, the super tips
Mhm,
for somebody that says, I just need some help from me to become and embrace curiosity.
mhm.
Where do I start? What is, if I just do these couple of things, that is what I can do right now. And that's going to help me embrace curiosity.
Pause. That's the
Mm.
pause, I think, is really powerful. And so, for example, if you're feeling disrespected at work, just pause and go, is this disrespect? Was this intentional? Or was this lack of respect in the forms that are important to me? What are the forms? What is important to me? How do I define that for myself? And I want to be really clear, this is not about talking yourself out of not having a conversation with that person. It truly is to pause and to collect your thoughts versus and it's okay to feel all these emotions. I'm also a really big fan of writing things down. I mean, I'm a writer. So, but I think it really helps anyone to journal and to make time for self-reflection because I think in this go, go, go world, we think that we should know the answers right away. And so there's the pause, there's even just writing it down. How does that look on paper? How does that look when I share it with someone else? And then that's another thing. The example of when I talked about it with another friend and she said, "Why don't you go ask what they mean?" You know, don't do this alone. So I think pause, write things down, talk to other people.
That is excellent advice. Pause. I think that could save so much heartache if just having the simple discipline to pause for a moment and think about it. I love that. I also love the second part is when, I mean, where you had someone you could go to, whether that's your journal and say, how does this look on paper? And you're asking and you're observing it. And then you've said several times that you had a friend that said, well, why don't you just go ask the person what they meant?
Mhm.
Um, how do you help people choose who they're talking to? Because here's a danger I see. Sometimes I'm just seeking to 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 get people into my corner.
Mhm.
I'm trying to tell my story. I'm trying to get people to like jump in the bandwagon and kind of support me and they're on my side now, right? So how can we know when we're talking to someone out of sincerity and curiosity or when we're just trying to get people to come in and support us at being pissed off at someone who disappointed us?
Well, and that's I think there's also the self-awareness there. I'm still angry and I just need to vent to someone. And so even just saying that, "Hey, I this just happened and I'm just angry and I just need you to hear me." And sometimes I have to be very explicit because sometimes people go straight into advice mode. It's like, "I don't need any advice right now."
Yeah,
And
that's
then
good.
and when I am ready to practice that curiosity, it's just, "Hey, can you help me see some other ways of interpreting this?"
I love that. The curiosity, pause, have curiosity, and then when I go to somebody, then curiosity for what they can help point you to.
And this one is just, "What do I want right now? What do I want? What do I need?" Because there are times where we just have to blow off steam, just, okay, anger, I'm exhausted by anger now. What's next? Because at some point we get exhausted by anger.
Okay, so another thing, you said you love to write things down, you love to journal. Do you have any personal practices that of course, you talk about curiosity being a practice. I talk about gratitude being a practice, and I think gratitude journaling is very helpful to that because that helps me be curious about really what's going on in me and finding gratitude in even the hardest things. Do you have any habitual or ritual practices that you do other than journaling or what are helpful?
Yeah, so actually very specifically around gratitude, my partner and I, before we have a meal, our form of grace is saying, "I'm grateful for." And we just talk about the things that we're grateful for, and it could just be, "I'm grateful I have health insurance. I'm grateful that the snow didn't prevent me from going out today. I'm grateful for this really wonderful conversation I had." And so to kind of notice those small things, and I've actually started doing with that with my brothers too. When we have our sibling dinner, at the end of dinner, we'll go around just, "Hey, what are you feeling grateful for?" And it's often an opportunity to share our observation and something simple. And it's also interesting. Sometimes we'll share, "I'm grateful you did this," or, "I'm grateful you helped me with this." And so sometimes it's about the person we're interacting with, and sometimes it's just out in the world. And I have to tell you, Randy, that for me, I realize I've been with my partner for 10 years. I realize that I love is a very big blobby word. And when I started this relationship, I was just, you know, the essence of love to me is not being taken for granted. I just don't want to feel taken for granted. I want someone to be grateful. And so instead of saying I love you, we say I'm grateful. And that's just our way of even just closing, just, okay, I'm grateful, the way that people say I love you. And then when we're together and we have a meal, then we express the specific things that we're grateful for. So those are some practices I have around gratitude.
Well, I love it. I believe in it, and I love what you're doing. And do you have anything specific that you're working on next?
Oh gosh. We actually are launching a mini workshop series to make, because usually our workshops are only for organizational clients. And so we're actually doing something to make it more accessible for individuals. And we do live learning experiences. So that's something that I'm excited about.
Well, I'm excited about that too because I would love to know how people, especially people who are listening here, can interact with what you do because I think it'd be amazing to have some type of workshop or experience on the individual level
Mhm.
because really truthfully, I think that it's the individual where all of this belongs and the individual is occupying a space in an organization. And so I need to adopt this curiosity and then that can change the world. We don't change the world, we change ourselves,
Yes,
and then
absolutely.
the world changes.
Yes, absolutely. And so that's why we want to make it available for individuals. And so we do things like how to give feedback with curiosity, how to have tough conversations with curiosity. And so it's just we want to open it up. So that's something, if people want to find out more, they can go to the curiositybased.com website.
Yep, we will put all that information in here. Julie, I'm so grateful for you. I am grateful.
I'm
And
grateful for you too.
I'm so happy you're doing good work and you're helping people become curious, improve their lives, improve their organizations, and and just for spreading the good work and spreading the conversation. So thank you so much, Julie, and we're so happy you could join us.
Thank you so much, Randy, for inviting me. I really enjoyed this conversation.